All right, my next guest is the former representative to the United Nations and now president of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, Ambassador Andrew Brenberg. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be with you.
All right, so we're supposed to talk about Generation Z. We've had the baby boomers, we've had Gen X, the millennials, Gen Z. Why are these people becoming more attracted to communism? And I'm going to break it up. Is it because of government-run education, pop culture? What is actually fueling the interest in communism?
So I think you've got two elements, and I'd focus on the second one as being the biggest driver. So on the front end, as you allude to, you've got elements within academia and elements within American culture that have promoted communism as being kind of a good idea, as something that would create, a perfect utopia, or that just hasn't been tried right yet. But the real problem, and that can sound alluring to people, the real problem though is that for an entire generations now, basically almost everyone younger than those of us, they've never learned anything about the horror of communist regimes during the 20th and now into the 21st century, right? That 100 million people have been murdered by communist regimes. I mean, let that sink in. Most people don't know that very kind of basic historical fact. And also the fact that 1.5 billion people still live under communism today and what life is like for them. And I think that, as I said at the outset, there's the allure of, oh, this is going to make everyone equal and down with the big man or something. But they don't have the basic facts that go along with it that make them step back and realize, oh my God, I mean, 100 million people murdered by these regimes, that's horrible. Like, I don't want to have anything to do with that. It's that part that I think has been missing now unfortunately, for several decades. I mean, ever since, the wall fell and we entered this kind of, end of history era where we thought communism was gone, we've not actually taught younger generations about the horrific crimes and abuses under communism just in the last century.
Well, look, I mean, there's a war in Ukraine right now. I mean, you don't have to look much further than Joseph Stalin. And one of the things you find about a communist regime is it promises an equal portion of resources to everyone. But when it turns out they can't deliver that, they just make fewer of everyone, right? You starve. If you say we promise, a bushel of wheat to every family in Mother Russia, and then you find out you can't promise that, well, just starve the Ukrainians and take their wheat.
That's exactly right. I mean, thinking about, many people now are learning about the horrors of the Holodomor, Stalin's state-imposed famine in Ukraine in the early 1930s, that in the span of 2 years killed millions of people through a state-imposed famine. I mean, that is outrageous and horrific to think about. You mentioned Joseph Stalin. You cannot understand Vladimir Putin and his, leadership and his aggressive behavior in Russia and his, totalitarian nature without understanding Stalin and communism. Sure, Russia today isn't a communist state, but this is a KGB thug that came up through communism. If you want to talk about someone who knows about the history of communism, Vladimir Putin absolutely does. And he's out there trying to rehabilitate and even lionize the image of Joseph Stalin, specifically, one of the most heinous mass murderers in human history. He under his regime, the Great Terror, the murder of tens of millions of people, not just the Ukrainians, but others from Central and Eastern Europe and Russians themselves, that were murdered under Stalin's various purges and famines. I mean, totally separate from war. We're not talking war victims here. This is just the absolute destruction of society under Stalin, and that if you don't understand that level of violence, you don't understand, hey, what's wrong? Everyone being equal sounds great.
Equally miserable.
Right.
Still to this day, you go into any college during the first couple of days, guaranteed you're going to find that brand spanking new Che Guevara shirt, right? It's like it will not die. It's like the Bob Marley poster or the Blacklight posters. I mean, college dormitory rooms haven't really changed in the better part of 50 years, but you could find that kid who just showed up and he's starting to not shave, he's got his sandals, and he's got his Che Guevara shirt. And if you even try to dispel the myth of Che Guevara, they don't want to hear it.
That's exactly right. And whether it's the Che Guevara T-shirts. Unfortunately, I've seen Stalin T-shirts. I've seen Mao T-shirts. And this is something that we at our new museum here in Washington are really excited about educating all our visitors, particularly young people, about, because hey, if it's an image of someone who seems to be a revolutionary leader, that sounds inspiring until you learn the whole story and learn about the murder of, in Cuba, the mass murder that took place during the revolution, and the incredible brutality and political oppression that happens in Cuba today. I mean, just almost 1 year ago, last summer, you had the largest protests in Cuba against the communist dictatorship, and we have over 1,000 political prisoners being held, in prison, outside of communication, just in the course of last year. So this is something happening today. I mean, if you want to look at like heroic figures, I mean, these are artists and musicians. These are not, political figures that are on hunger strikes, that are being brutalized and abused by their government for, writing a rap song, Patria y Vida, talking about fatherland and life, talking about what life is like under communism. These aren't political activists. These are artists who, under communism, can't help but become dissidents because of what the regime does. So I mean, those are images I think are more appropriate, inspiring for young people to focus on, not the images of murderers that killed women, children, priests, throughout Cuba, and you confiscated everybody's property.
But our millionaire artists and musicians tend to do the opposite. I mean, I remember Warren Beatty Reds. There was the Bryan Cranston vehicle, Dalton. The story of Dalton Trumbo. I mean, they're a band after Rage Against the Machine. I mean, they were on Sony Records. They were played on Clear Channel radio stations. It was cost like $80, $90 to get a ticket, and maybe $20 for a T-shirt. All for them to tell you that communism was great.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately these people either don't know, or we're never presented with the basic facts of, wait, these are regimes that sent millions to gulag, forced labor camps, not only in the past, but still today. We see millions of people detained in Western China, in Xinjiang, Uyghur Muslim minorities that are detained now. Millions of people detained for no other reason than their ethnic or religious minority and forced into forced labor. That's happening right now as we speak. And this is horrific. And these, both the crimes of communism in the past and the ongoing crimes of communism today, I think are essential to put in the public's mind, particularly young people. They reject this. I mean, no young person I've ever spoken to thinks, yeah, that's a great idea to lock up 2 million Uyghurs in Western China and subject them to forced labor because the Communist Party wants to destroy their religion and culture. No one's going to defend that when you actually put that in front of them. Similarly, the incredible brutality throughout Central and Eastern Europe under Soviet communism, particularly put in the face of the incredible brave resistance that you saw throughout the region that succeeded in toppling communism in 1989, which I'm sure you and I remember. But these are the real facts, not just the theory of communism, but the victims of communism that need to be put in front of people so they see this is the wake of human death and destruction that this ideology creates everywhere it has been tried.
But do you think if that's too much for people to bear, right? That's just it's just easier to wear the Che Guevara shirt and talk about how horrible the oil companies are, or if you grew up in the 80s, Reagan was bad, man, or same thing for Trump or whatever it is, that it's just easier to feel like, well, I'm more emotionally intelligent than you, and you're just this nasty capitalist, even though everything around you is capitalism. I got 30 seconds.
Sure. Well, I mean, look, I certainly agree it can be hard to do, but I think the results are quite telling. When you encounter someone and put forward the actual victims of communism in front of their face, there's nowhere to hide, right? There's nowhere for the idea.
Yeah, but they still tend to, like you said, they think we just haven't done it right. We can get it right here. If we put the smartest minds from the Ivy League together, we can make communism work here in the United States.